Hey there, class. I appreciate you being attentive today in light of my absence, and I hope these videos are very helpful. The goal of this video is to walk through the lecture on the exegetical outline, covering a little bit more of the technical side of what it is designed to accomplish and how we do it. We are going to do a classroom exercise afterwards, and then we'll resume that at the beginning of next class when I'm back on campus. So I hope this is helpful, and of course, we'll be dialoguing about this for a while as we go. All right, so here's what an exegetical outline is. It can be defined as a visual representation of the argument flow in a passage. Think about the diagrams we have already done. We did the line diagram where every word is connected to every other word. And that shows you the grammatical relationship of the words. We've done the clausal layout that shows you the way the clauses relate. So those are both very grammatical and linguistic. The exegetical outline does much the same thing, but it is now moving from grammar and clause to argument and logic. So this brings a level of synthesis to the outlining process. Excuse me. So this is a visual tool, but it's also logical. It's not just grammatical. It is organized. It's not just a list. And it really helps you get a sense of what the flow of the argument is, which is what we want to do when we look at any one particular passage. So here's what is going to happen in the exegetical outline. That will present the results of your analysis of the grammar. You're going to bring out in the exegetical outline the grammatical analysis that you've done on all the major structural markers. It will also present a synthesis of the argument flow. This will be both in the grammatical details you include in the statements that you have, but also in the way that you organize. The goal will be to see how the author puts the argument together by using the outline form. It's both detailed and big picture. I mentioned in the prior video that I consider this a moving over into synthesis. There is still analysis. There's still details of the passage that we're going to look at, but it's also very interested in the big picture. What do we see about the paragraph as a whole, and how does it work? And the reason that's the case is because the goal is to provide an overview of the passage argument. We want to see what Paul argues as a whole in this paragraph. We're not just looking at an individual word or a sentence. We're looking at the whole paragraph and how he puts the argument together. And you could really argue that this is one of the primary tools that we will use to help us move towards exposition. Yes, we talk about the meaning of words. Yes, we talk about grammatical elements. But when we exposit a text, we are interested in the flow of the argument as a whole primarily, and this tool gets us in that direction. Now, here's what it does not do. It does not simply present themes or topics. Oftentimes what you see in outlines are a presentation of a list of the themes. We're a bit more detailed than that. We're going to show how they fit together and how they create the argument. So it's not just a theme or a topic list. Nor is it just generalities. When we do an exegetical outline, we do not stay at the level of, in Ephesians 2:11 through 22, Paul is discussing the church. That's much too general. We're going to deal with specifics. It does not simply restate the text. We are going to create subject complement statements that help interpret and explain the text. It does not leave metaphors unexplained. We will explain those as part of the process because the goal of the exegetical outline is to be as explanatory as possible. Nor does an exegetical outline leave problems unsolved. In other words, when you come through to a passage and you think through the validation issues, you need to solve those before you do the exegetical outline on the argument that the exegetical outline is supposed to show us the exegesis, the end result. Now, that will be, of course, a little bit undone in this particular assignment because you won't have thought of everything, but that's something to aim for, especially as you move towards the first paper. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you a couple of examples that will help you see what we are aiming for. So the first thing I want to do is move to a Logos presentation of different outlines of Ephesians and to show you what you normally see as an outline and to show you how it is a little bit deficient in what we are aiming for. So let me click on the right link and open that, and then let me change the view so you can see this better. All right, so this is the Bible Outline Browser in Logos. And what you can do is put in a verse reference, and then it will scour all the books in your library so that you can see different outlines for them. So let's take a look at this first one. This is the Bible Exposition Commentary by Warren Wiersbe, and it's giving us an outline of the book of Ephesians. Fair enough. Notice, though, that this is working at the level of themes and topics. We go beyond that. We have full statements which deal with a lot of detail. So to simply say that chapters 1 through 3 deal with doctrine or riches in Christ is not enough for our purposes. So what you have oftentimes seen as an outline is really just a thematic presentation of what's going on in a book or a passage. We are going to have more detail than that. What you'll notice is that most of the outlines that the Bible Outline Browser shows you are at that level because they are drawing from books that are presented for more common consumption, and therefore they are going to be a bit more reductionistic and more thematic. Let's take a look at the Bible Knowledge Commentary. The calling of the church, chapters 1 through 3, versus the conduct of the church. Great for exposition, not for exegesis. It's not enough detail. So here's the main point I want to get to you by showing you this. Most of what you understand as an outline for our purposes will not be detailed enough. Usually the outlines that we consume more publicly and popularly are at the level of themes or topics, and we're going to work at a more detailed level. Now, let me show you a couple of other examples that I think would be helpful too. So let me change my view. And let me click on a link here that should be helpful. So let's get that open. Whoops, sorry, it's taking a little bit of time. And there we go. Now let me change my view so you can see that. Now this is an outline that I did when I was doing my Galatians commentary. Basically, it's a list of the subject complement statements that I made for each clause in the passage, and then I organized it into an outline form. Now this is fairly short because this passage was only 5 verses, but you can see the level of detail that we are going to aim for. Notice that everything's a full sentence. Notice that I have down to 3 levels of the outline. I've got verse references everywhere. All of that is really helpful in determining and helping you see what we want. Let me show you another example. Let me open that really quickly. What you'll see here is a much more involved outline. This covers Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 through 29. And notice the detail that I've got. I have very full statements for every point. I've got verse references all along the way. Every clause is represented here, and then there are even summary statements which synthesize and organize the clauses. This is what we are aiming to do. We are aiming for a very detailed yet synthetic outline of the passage that gives us all the details to help us understand what's going on. So just wanted you to see those as examples so that you could know what we are aiming for and rethink what you understand an outline to be. Okay. So here's how we're going to go about constructing the exegetical outline. Here's the things that you're going to need to get in place before you get started. First, your structural layout of Greek clauses. We build the exegetical outline based upon the clausal layout. That's why for the exegetical outline assignment, you're going to need to revise your structural layout. It needs to be in great shape. Otherwise, the outline will be in poor shape. So you have to have a good structural layout in order to get started. You also have to know the syntactical classification of the key terms on the structural layout. That is, for every key element of the big 5 that you identify, you need to know how it is working grammatically. For example, if you have an adverbial participle, you need to know whether it's temporal, adverbial, means, whatever the case may be, because that will impact the way we write that statement for that clause. It is helpful to have your grammatical diagram, although not completely necessary, but that can clarify some things for you as you go. You also want to be working on key validation problems and have those solutions because that explanation will come out as you do the exegetical outline, although we recognize at this point in the class those are in process. And then you also need to have a good understanding of key figures of speech, although those are also in process. Remember, the exegetical outline, in a sense, is a summation of your exegesis, and so you need to know how to explain things, including the metaphors of the passage, the figures of speech, etc. So with your layout, with your syntactical classifications, with your diagram, your validation problems, and your understanding of the figures of speech, you're then ready to begin the exegetical outlining process. Now, there's 2 things to really focus on as you do the exegetical outline. First, we're going to think about the wording of the statements to show the content. As you saw from the outlines that I showed you, they all have very in-depth statements. We want to figure out how to write those. And then second, we're going to look at the organization of statements to show the flow of the argument. That's the two things that I will look for as we grade this. We want to see the wording of your statements. Does it accurately pull together the details? And have you organized the statements in such a way that you're accurately showing the flow of the argument of the passage? A couple of other things to keep in mind. Every point in the outline must be a full sentence. It does not matter which, if it's a Roman numeral, a letter A, a number one, what have you, they all must be full sentences. And they need to be about 30 words or less in order to summarize the key points of the text. That's a bit arbitrary. We could go for more, we could go for less, but the point is you have to make some decisions in order to summarize and synthesize. So this is where we try to balance the details of the passage with the summation that we're going to do as we move forward. So keep these in mind as you move forward. Now, here's what we write in these statements. We are working with what we call a subject complement statement. And that is a very specific kind of sentence that conveys the information about the text in a detailed yet clear way. And so here's the way it breaks down. Each point has a subject. In other words, each sentence that we create, each point in the outline will have a subject. And this is what the author is talking about. That will be the topic about which something is asserted. And that is the clearly defined topic of the passage that is covered. For independent clauses, that's going to be a summation of the subject in the context. And we'll talk through some examples of how to do that. And then for dependent clauses, that's usually the structural marker's grammatical force plus what the structural marker modifies. Now, this sounds a little bit weird, but once you see some examples and once we work through some, you will understand how this works. But keep in mind, what we are aiming for is proper detail. Oftentimes, the subject is poorly written if it is too general. For example, your tendency in the exegetical outline you're about to undertake is to write statements like Gentiles were excluded. Well, there's a problem there. Gentiles as a subject is too broad. Paul is not talking about Gentiles everywhere and Gentiles in every situation and everything about their existence. He's specifically talking about where they were before. So we want to refine that and say things instead like the prior state of Gentiles before Christ. That's more to the point of what Paul is getting at. So the subject is a clearly defined topic with appropriate detail that explains what the author is talking about in context. Now, the complement is what the author asserts. It's what the author says about that subject. And that usually comes from the predicate if it's an independent clause, or it comes from the actual content of the clause of the structural marker if it's a dependent clause. Now, again, that sounds a little funky, but we're going to explain that and show a couple of examples to make that work. And basically what the complement does is it completes the subject by providing the content that is asserted. For example, let's go back to the statement. We said something before, the bad statement, the one that was too general, was Gentiles were excluded. Well, remember, we're not talking about Gentiles in every aspect of their existence. Paul is talking about the prior state of Gentiles before Christ was one of exclusion from the people of God. That's a lot more detail that gets much more at the heart of what Paul is arguing. Think about it this way. The statement Gentiles were excluded is a fair summation of the theology of the Bible, but Paul is talking about something more specific. He's dealing with something that is much more detailed than that general statement. So we are always going to be aiming for that larger detail that shows the proper subject and what Paul is actually arguing. So think about these sentences that you're going to write as two parts. The subject is the details about what the author is talking about, and then the complement are the appropriate details of what he asserts about that particular topic. A couple of other things to keep in mind. The exegetical outline uses Harvard-style outline numbering. That is, Roman numerals, then the second point is uppercase letters, and then the next points are Arabic numerals, and then if you need it, lowercase letters. We are going to be very picky about that just because that's the way we've done it, and that's the way we want you to do it to provoke to make sure that it's organized. So use Harvard-style outline numbering. Next, remember that each point must show the verse that it covers. You'll notice that we will have to use something like A, B, and C. Think of it this way. We have the verse number, and then the clause in order is indicated by A, B, or C. So 1B would be the second clause of verse 1. 13A would be the first clause of verse 13. 14D would be the fourth clause of verse 14, etc. So every line must have that marker to show what verse that clause particularly modifies. Now, the basic thing that we're going to do is show organization and subordination within the outline through statements tied to specific clauses and through statements which cover groups of clauses. Think about the grocery list example that I showed you, or the example about, my loving family. We're going to organize and superimpose some logic onto the paragraph by being very careful about creating summary statements and organizing them as appropriate. So here's how we do that. The very first thing that you need to do is to create subject complement statements for each clause in the layout. So you have a structural layout of the passage, and it has, I'm just going to guess and say 15 clauses. You will create a subject complement statement for every one of those 15 clauses. And that's why our structural layout needs to be good. It needs to be, shall we say, as minimal as possible. The general error that people make on the clausal layout is that they multiply the clauses, they make too many, and that means that the exegetical outline then has too much complexity. So that's why we're very strict on what constitutes a clause in the clausal layout. So therefore, your outline will be only as complex as necessary and as simple as possible. So let's say you've got 15 lines in your layout. That means that you will start with 15 subject complement clauses that you then create. Then the next step is to group those into logical conceptual units. Think through what's being argued. For example, the first 5 might talk about the prior state of the Gentiles. Then the next 6 may talk about what Christ has done for us. And those then divide into the peace that Christ has brought, and then the unity that he has brought between Jew and Gentile. I mean, there's any number of ways that it could be organized in terms of the logic. But your job is to think through the 15 or so clauses that you've got and then organize them into groups, logical groups, which you then create a new sentence for. In other words, you summarize. So if you've got a group of 3 statements that you believe hang together, your job is to create a subject complement statement that then organizes them in the appropriate way. And as you can see, what that will do is that will build the structure of the outline from the bottom up. And then once you reach where you have your Roman numerals, you then create an exegetical main idea, a subject complement statement, which covers the whole. So you can see what we're trying to do. We're not imposing a structure from the top down, although there is a sense in which we can see that as we read through the passage, because there are certain grammatical markers, there's certain conjunctions, etc., that show us the structure of the passage. But what we're doing is we're thinking about the logic of the statements and how they are grouped, and then we build additional statements on top that then get organized into the outline. So here's a rough way to think about it. You want to think about the subject complement statements that you make in this very first step. You can see the first solid bullet point, create subject complement statements for each clause in the layout. Those very likely should be your Arabic numerals, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You need to organize them so that you can then create statements like A, B, C, D, and then you create a new statement, your Roman numerals, in a way that groups the A, B, C, D. So I realize that doesn't make a lot of sense. We will work through this again when I'm back if it doesn't, but the goal is think about these as the bottom level subpoints. You are then going to organize statements above them, and then you're going to group those new statements into organized statements, which create the Roman numeral structure of the outline. So here's a very practical process. List your structural markers along with verse references. Make sure that you've identified what things to modify. Think through all of your grammar. Create subject complement statements for each one of those structural markers and list them in sequence. In other words, just get everything out as we go. And then we will move to grouping them. And that's where we make judgment calls. We have to think about the topics and the argument and the way the author puts things together. We want to group things logically. Even though this seems subjective, we are actually working with the inherent logic of the passage so that we can then put everything together. Think conceptually. How does the argument flow? What does the author say? What's the context? And how does he move from point A to point B? You could argue, for example, that in our passage, Paul moves from discussing the Gentiles to discussing Christ to discussing the Gentiles again. So it seems that we've got a logic, and the grouping of the statements that we create will help us in that regard. And then what we do is we group the subject complement statements that we've made at the bottom level into logical divisions, and then we create higher level subject complement statements on top of each of those divisions. So for example, let's assume that our 15 statements, they divide into 3 groups of 5. We then make 3 new subject complement statements that group those groups of 5. And then I have to look at those 3 upper level statements and see how I can group them together so that I can then create the Roman numerals for my particular passage. So again, starting at the bottom and then building up conceptually until we get to the top. Okay, I've already discussed this, so I'm gonna move forward. The second point here is helpful. When you get to the final point that you have the outline done, you need to create what we call an exegetical main idea for the entire passage. In other words, look at your Roman numerals and think about how you would summarize them to create a subject complement statement that covers the entirety of the passage. And that then is a great summary of what the passage is doing that you can then use in exposition and in a way to understand the passage as a whole. A couple of things I want to close with that will help you make sure that you don't make some common mistakes when we come to the exegetical outline. The first thing is to remember is that every subpoint must have at least 2. So for example, if there's an A, you have to have a B. If there's a 1, you have to have a 2. Now, this may seem somewhat arbitrary, but the reason that this works is because if you build from the bottom up, if you start with the list of your statements and you organize them together, you won't run into this problem. You will organize things properly. It's when you start from the top down, which is not the way we want to work with the outline, that you run into this difficulty. So make sure that as you build your outline, you go from the bottom up, and that will then avoid this problem. But the basic way to think about it is every A has to have a B, every 1 has to have a 2, etc. The other thing to remember is that everything must properly summarize what's underneath it. So for example, if you have a Roman numeral 1, I have to see in that content that you appropriately summarize A, B, and C under it. If you have a B, I need to see that you properly summarize 1 and 2 under it. So make sure that you're working at the level of proper summary as we go. Now, I don't have this on the slide, but the other thing that you have to remember is every line in the outline must show the verses that it covers. If you leave those off, that shows that you're not thinking properly. So make sure you have the verse references for every line in the outline. All right, so here's just a recap of what we're going to do and why we do exegetical outline. It's a convenient way to show the argument flow in a passage. It's a convenient way to show your decisions about the passage. Remember, it's built from the bottom up, from the list of the statements, not from the top down. It's a working base for your teaching and preaching, but it's not a homiletical outline, but it helps inform it. And it brings clarity by structuring what you're going to convey about a particular passage. Now, in order to recap this, what we're going to do is an in-class exercise. So I'm going to stop this video, and then we'll restart by working on an in-class exercise.